First of all, I have to say I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a expert in strategic communication. I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm interested in what happens when we tell stories, what happens in our minds, in our brains. And in the next 20 minutes, I will try to tell you a bit more what we know from experimental, empirical evidence point of view concerning the storytelling. And my core of the argument is pretty simple. So humans are sensitive to storytelling, according to what we know from the cognitive science and cognitive psychology, because human experience consists not of objects, not of things, not of humans, but of events. And events have a particular structure called narrative structure, consisting of a starting point, a sort of peak or culmination, and the resolution. So although some narratives can contain different events, and vice versa, some events can contain different narratives, the point is still that the basic element of human experience is event. So what we have in our memory is a series, is configurations of events. And what is interesting, and what I will try to show you also based on some fascinating research on human perception, sometimes humans are blind to certain information simply because they are focused on one particular series of events. Well, the idea is if we are focused on a particular series of events, we are, in a sense, blind to alternative series of events that eventually interrupts the one that we are focusing on. I will talk a bit more about that a couple of minutes later. Okay, so humans are more sensitive to the form of events, event structure, than to the truth of the content. So that's basically the same that Mr. Sartz mentioned in the very beginning. I would like to emphasize this idea because there are lots of research evidences showing this from different perspectives, emphasizing this from different perspectives. Of course, if you think about strategic communication, there are some precondition, or there are some, I would say, input conditions to make things more efficient. First of all, we should have some shared knowledge. If we don't have shared knowledge among the speaker and the audience, we have very difficult to coordinate the content of the message. The second, our message is more successful if we can induce sort of in-group, out-group differences in audience. So if we can generate in-group, if we can generate a bunch of people having a sense of belongingness, then we are doing much better than just telling stories and having sort of neutral. Well, I don't think that telling stories can be sort of neutral format of communicating something. But anyway, so if we can induce this in-group, out-group generation, then we are more successful. And finally, emotions. If we can strategically control and coordinate emotions, that's a very powerful tool for emphasizing the content of message. So, and I will return to shared ground and group, our group in a couple of minutes. So we can ask, well, why is this the case that humans are more sensitive to the form of message than to the content? What is this? How does it come? What is the point? Well, according to what we know from developmental psychology, the starting point of human perception, actually all human cognitive processes, is object perception. We are starting our experience from objects. Now, there are two kinds of objects that we are confronted with. There are objects in space, like chairs, plenary speakers, buildings, cities, okay? And there are objects in time, basically what we call events. Now, the point is that human experience consists of events. And events have narrative structure, the starting point, the sort of combination, and the resolution. And, of course, events also consist of spatial objects. Now, the question whether these events are factual, or whether they are imaginary, or whether they are fake, that's basically a secondary point. Okay, so next I would like to give you some brief overview what is going on in cognitive science research on events. So it's I'm not attempting to give you sort of 100% what we know about events in cognitive science, but sort of overview most important studies in the last 20 years, the highlights. Probably the whole enterprise of events and narratives are in virtue of Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is a cognitive psychologist and a neuroscientist working on event perception, and well, he wrote a couple of books and lots of nice papers. I mean, as for books understanding events or event cognition, there are sort of highlights for everybody who works on events. Then, of course, I have to mention the mentor of Jeff, namely Barbara Tversky, who did amazing work on spatial, temporal experience and the way we segment our spatio-temporal experience. So basically, I'd say lots of narrative in a very empirical, very sort of hardcore experimental way is conducted in Barbara's lab and also Jeff's lab. Okay. Well, the whole 2017 work on events is based on a paper by Jeff and Barbara, a 2001 paper by Jeff and Barbara, where they argue that, well, and they provide a canonical definition, what is event. Actually, if you want to see what is the definition that most of cognitive scientists, I would say 99% of cog-sci people would agree, then this is the one. Event, I'm quoting, is a segment of time that is conceived by an observer to have a beginning and an end. We call the process by which observers identify those beginnings and endings and their relationships event structure perception. And okay, so there are some consequences arising from this definition. First of all, events are mental structures. There are no events in the real world. We are construing events. Okay? The second thing is events have some asymmetry. So we are not equally sensitive to event beginnings and to event endings. Okay? We have, depending on the event, we have different sensitivity to different parts of events. Then all events are causal structures. Something happens because of something. Somebody has caused the event. Okay. Some event take place because of somebody. Okay. It's very hard to explain an event without causality, without telling what is the reason for this event. It's close to impossible. Then, of course, events can be of different temporal and spatial scale. Of course, we can talk about event in this room. We can talk about event in my office. We can talk about Christmas party. Okay, we can talk about Christmas as a generic event all around the globe. Well, so events can be different spatial and temporal scales. And sometimes events are discontinuous. Okay, so let me give you some distinctions if you want to classify events. It's a part of my paper that I'm going to publish eventually next year, not this anymore. So there are three canonical events. First of all, there are historical events. And historical events are always source biased. So we are better in telling about the reason why somebody happened. We are better in telling why a historical event took place than what was the outcome. Okay, then we have events where we are not actually self-involved, but these events are actual. For instance, something that is happening in the main building of the University of Latvia right now. Well, it's probably not important for me. Okay, so it's difficult to say whether it's source bias or not. Then we have events where we are involved, and then these actual self-involved events are very different from historical ones. So for instance, if I would ask you, what are you doing here right now? You would be better in telling the details of the goal while you are here than in telling what is the point where you started from, okay? So if you are conducting experiment, if you are asking, what are you doing right now? What is the happening that you are involved in? You will have answers where you have more detail, more descriptive details concerning the goal, concerning the outcome. Okay, there is a recent, just a few weeks old paper by German colleagues where they did wonderful work. They did 8 different studies where they tried to explore historical events, and they showed a wonderful experimental evidence what is going on in those historical events. Now let me give you just an overview. So for instance, if you are asking why a historical event took place, most of people are much better telling about the starting points or telling about the initial part of the event than the end. Okay, the ends are less good in descriptive details. Then we can have lots of concrete cases. They have, for instance, World War I or Napoleonic Wars, or for instance, several historic persons like Victoria or William III, and so. And the pattern is the same. The pattern is the same. We are better in telling the starting points than the endings of the historical events. And well, they did also some sort of kind of contemporary studies where they asked, well, what about seasons? Can you describe a season? And they were able to observe that the starting parts or beginnings of events are much better encoded in human memory than the endings. Okay, that's, by the way, that's a very important consequence if you are planning a strategic message, what to focus on if you are having historical material. As I mentioned before, events have a narrative structure. What does it mean? I think I've already mentioned the whole point, but every narrative structure consists of an initial phase, of a peak, and release. And of course, those phases they are more or less detailed, and they have several features, each of them. And actually, what is important, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about visual narrative, or whether we are talking about verbal narrative, whether we are talking about fairy tales, whether we are talking about movies, we have the same structure of the event that we are encoding in our memory. There's a nice paper by Neil Cohn on the visual structure of a narrative, where he argues that the same thing that happens when we observe cartoons happens when we read news. Okay, it's the same idea. And then, of course, if somebody is interested in more comprehensive work on narrative, then I would recommend the late Tony Sanford's and Catherine Emmett's book on mind, brain, and narrative, where they basically say that humans are sensitive to narratives because they adopt a subjective perspective when they comprehend the narrative. That's one thing. The other thing is humans are construing mental models when they are perceiving narratives. Okay, that's not just a neutral message. Humans, when perceiving narratives, they are construing sort of a subjective model where they are integrating their own subjective, eventually idiosyncratic information, and some also objective, intersubjective, sort of familiar information, which is part of shared ground. And according to Sanford and Emmett, we have several components, basically overlapping with what I told before, but there are some nice exceptions. So we have some setting, we have theme, plot, we have resolution. We also need some shared knowledge. We have chronological order. We have sometimes we have narrator, sometimes not. Okay, sometimes we have implicit narrator. But it's, by the way, interesting if you think about messages. Messages always have some sort of narrator background. Well, it's interesting whether they are more sensitive to audience if the narrator is present, or if not. Then we always have a foreground, the primary actor in messages. And sometimes we also have a secondary actor. Well, what is important, that's the core point of my presentation. I'm moving to the end of what I wanted to tell you. A narrative tends to modulate human attention. And if the author of a narrative, if the strategical communicator controls the message, controls the structure of events, controls the structure of narrative, he or she can have a very focused impact on the audience. So the point is that humans are sensitive to a particular sequence of events. So we are not good in switching between different sequences, different structures of events. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why so many humans are open to fake news. I mean, that's not because humans are stupid or blind or whatever. That's simply because they are sensitive to a particular series of events. And there is a wonderful example from perception research, a study by Dan Simons and Daniel Levin. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this study, but let me show you, and then I'll say just a few final sentences.
The Door Study. This video shows a participant from a 1998 study by Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin. Watch what happens as the unsuspecting pedestrian provides directions. The young man on the left is one of the experimenters. He has approached the white-haired man and asked for directions. Watch closely as two people carrying a door pass between them, and the first experimenter is replaced by someone else. Like many of the people in this study, the pedestrian was entirely unaware that he was talking to a different person. Approximately 50% of the people approached in this study didn't notice when the person they were talking to was replaced by someone else. This study was among the first to demonstrate that change blindness can occur outside of the laboratory.
Okay, so what is going on here? So we have a time scale, and we have two different series of events. Okay, and event 1, event 2, and these two events are crashing, or they are in a certain point overlapping. Now, in this certain point, we are, as the half of the participants, 50%, which is a lot, we are literally blind. What is going on? And I think this is a point that is sometimes neglected when talking about fake news, when talking about impact of storytelling, when talking about sensitivity to stories and narratives. Okay, so let me say a couple of final remarks. One and the same content is perceived better if it's a narrative. That's something that Mr. Sads mentioned in the very beginning, and I do entirely agree. That's something that is different rather than just instruction and description. Okay, if you want to define what is the most sensitive message, and we can do that. A most sensitive message from what we know in CogSci is a message which is event-based narrative. Second, which is combined with shared knowledge and which is emotionally shaped. It doesn't matter whether good or bad, but it's emotionally shaped. There are lots of studies showing the emotional contagion in social media. Third, this message should somehow induce in-group effects. If it occurs, that's cool, that's wonderful. The message is very focused, very successful, appealing to a certain audience. And finally, well, then this message is efficient, but it's not anymore important whether the message corresponds to reality, whether the message is true. Okay, that's probably it's good or bad, but the fact is that we are sensitive to events consisting of narrative structure. And that's basically all I wanted to say, and I hope we will probably have some questions, some discussion in the discussion part after all this talk. Thank you.